Now look at the links in the footer and the mobile version of our website. Here we have collapsible sections. So we can click on this section to expand or collapse it. So before we build the footer component, we want to build a reusable collapsible component. Now what do we need here? Well, every collapsible component should have two sections, a header and a body or content area. When we click on the header, the content expands or collapses. Now in the header, we have two elements, a heading, which can be an H2, an H3, or any kind of heading element, and an icon. So back to index.html, let's add a div with the class of collapsible. Now in this div, we're going to have a header, which can include an H2, let's say item 1, and an icon. So let's pull up our icons template, copy all this code, then bring it here. Now we're going to replace the icon with chevron. So here's the header section. And right after that, we have the content section. So we add a div with a class of collapsible, _, content. And here we can have anything. It doesn't have to be a list of links. We can simply have a paragraph of text, okay? So let's see what we get up to this point. All right, there are a few things we need to improve. First, we need to put the chevron over here. How can we do that? Using flex. So as you know, using flex, we can lay out items horizontally or vertically. So back to our markup, here's our header element. I'm going to give it a class called collapsible, _, header. Now we're going to use flex in this element. So back to our style sheet, let's define a new section for collapsibles. Now we add a new rule, collapsible header. Here we should set the display to flex. Let's see what we get. Good. Now we have some space over here. This is coming from the top margin of the heading. So back to our markup. Here's our heading. I'm going to give this a class. Let's say collapsible heading. Now in the future, we can replace this H2 with an H3 or any other kind of element. As long as we have this class, everything is going to work. So let's copy this. Now we define a new rule for our heading and set the top margin to 0. Now take a look. That's better. Now I want to push the chevron to the right side of the container. So back to our header, we're going to set justify content to space between. This will push the items to the edges of the container and add space between that. So here's what we get. Great. Now, in this implementation, we are not applying a width to our collapsible because we want our collapsible to be responsive and fluid. So we can put it in any container and the actual width will be determined by the container. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to reduce the size of the heading. So here's the heading element. Let's set the font size to 3 rems. That's better. Now, there are a couple of problems with our icon. First, it has a container, which we don't need. And second, the icon is blue. We want to change that to white. So back to our markup. Here we have a span with the class of icon container. We're going to remove this and just use an SVG. Okay. Now for the color, we're going to use icon white. Okay, great. Now a collapsible can be in two states. It's either collapsed or expanded. In this implementation, our collapsible is expanded. So we set the content and the chevron is pointing down. Now I want to change this implementation and make the collapsible initially collapsed. Then when we click on this icon, the collapsible will expand, okay? So there are a couple of things we need to do. First, we need to turn the chevron so it points to the right. So we have to rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise. And then we need to hide the content area. So back to our markup. Here's the icon for the chevron. I'm going to give this an extra class, collapsible chevron. I don't want to rely on this icon class because maybe in the content area, we're going to have some other icons. So I don't want to apply a style to all icons in a collapsible. That's why I defined an extra class. Now let's style this. So we define a new rule, and using the transform property, we rotate this 90 degrees counterclockwise. Take a look. That looks good. Next, we need to hide the content area. So earlier we defined a class for the content area that is collapsible content. So I'm going to copy this and define a rule for it here. So here we set display to none. Good. So now our collapsible is collapsed. So let's implement the expanded state. Back to our markup. Here's our collapsible component. We're going to define a new class, let's say collapsible double hyphen expanded. So this is a modifier for a collapsible. Now, if we have this class at the top level, then we're going to rotate the chevron so it points down, and we're going to show the content area. So back to our style sheet, we define a new rule. If we have a collapsible that is expanded, the chevron should point down. So once again, using the transform property, we rotate it to 0, which is its initial position. Let's verify it's working. Great. Now using the same technique, we're going to show the content area. So we use nesting one more time. If we have an expanded collapsible, then the content area should be visible. So we set display to block. Take a look. Great. We're almost there. Now let me show you something really cool. So let's inspect this element. Now look at this element. It's currently expanded, right? Now if we double click here and remove the expanded class, let's change it to something else. It doesn't matter. Our collapsible collapsed. Did you see that? We can expand it by adding this class back. So now what we need to do is to use JavaScript to dynamically insert this class when the user clicks on the header. Now, since this is the third part of my HTML and CSS series, I didn't want to assume the knowledge of JavaScript to take this course. So if you don't know JavaScript, don't worry at all. I've already created the code for you. It's only a few lines of code. So in the zip file that I gave you at the beginning of the course, we have this code folder where you can find the completed code. Here we have Moshify, and we have a folder called JS, which is short for JavaScript. All I want you to do now is to add this folder to your project. So we're going to drag and drop this folder over here and then select copy folder. Good. So now we have a JavaScript file. Let me review the JavaScript code real quick. So here we have main.js. All we are doing here is using the document object, which is a reference to the current page, to query and find all elements that have the collapsible class. Now we get all those elements, store them here. Then using the for each method, we can iterate over them. We get each item, and then using this method, add event listener, we register a function to be called when that item is clicked. In other words, with this piece of code, we're going to find all collapsible elements, and when the user clicks on them, we're going to execute some code. What is that code? It's right here. We're going to the list of classes for that element and toggle this particular class, collapsible expanded. So if this class exists, we're going to remove it. Otherwise, we're going to add it. Now, the final code that I'm going to supply might be a little bit different from what you see here because I haven't completed the project. So don't worry if there are a few more lines before or after this code. This is the main concept. Now, if you want to learn JavaScript, I have a few JavaScript courses on my website, so you can learn them after this course. Now, we have a JavaScript file, back to index.html. Down the bottom, before we close the body element, we're going to add a script element. So script, tab. Here we set the source attribute to js/main.js. Now, the reason we add JavaScript code at the end of our HTML document is that we don't want this JavaScript code to hold the rendering of our page. So we want the page to quickly render, and then the browser is going to download and execute our JavaScript file, okay? So with this, now we can go back to our browser and click on the header to expand or collapse this component. Beautiful. Now, one last touch. We want to add an interesting animation here. Back to the rule for our chevron. As you can see, we're using the transform property to change the direction of the chevron. Now, we can use the transition property to make this transformation smooth. So we want to animate this property. We say the transform should happen within 0.3 seconds. Now take a look. Click. Beautiful. Now, we need one more animation for the content area, but there's a problem here. For the content area, we're setting the display to none or block depending on the state of the collapsible. Unfortunately, we cannot animate this property. So we cannot say transition display 0.3 seconds. Nothing is going to happen. So I'm going to show you a trick. Instead of the display property, we're going to set the maximum height of this element to 0. Now, why aren't we using the height property? I'll talk about that in a second. So we're going to use max height. Now, with the height of 0, we're going to have overflow. So the content will still be visible no matter what state the collapsible is in, because we have overflow. So to hide the content, we have to set overflow to hidden. Now, when we are in the collapse state, the content area is invisible. So initially we set the height to 0 and overflow to hidden. When the user expands the collapsible, then we're going to change these two properties. So we're going to set max height to 100 VH. With this, we're saying that the height of the content area can be maximum of 100% of the height of the viewport. So we are allowing it to stretch vertically, but it's not going to stretch more than its content because we're using the max height property. If instead we use the height property and set it to 100 VH, the content area would take up the entire height of the viewport. This is not what we want. That is why we use max height. So this is the limit that we're going to apply, but the actual height will be determined by the content of this element, okay? Now, back to the first rule for the content area. Here we want to apply the transition property. Which property are we animating? Max height. So max height should change in 0.3 seconds. Now take a look. Expand. See that? Nice. Now we can make this even better. Back to the first rule, when the content area is hidden, we can set the opacity to 0. And then when the content area is expanded, we can set the opacity back to 1. Now take a look. Okay, we don't see any changes because this is the only property that we're animating. So to animate multiple properties, we can use all. Now see the difference. Do you see that nice fade out effect? That looks beautiful. We're pretty much done. Now let's take this collapsible and duplicate it to see what it looks like in a real scenario. So I'm going to take this entire div that represents our collapsible and duplicate it. Now save the changes. Take a look. So we have two collapsibles. It looks beautiful. Now, obviously, this looks nothing like the links in the footer. But at this point, we don't want to worry about styling this collapsible. We can always add that as a skin later. The whole purpose of the lesson was to create the structure for a collapsible component. This dark background that we have here and this kind of grayish text, these are really the styles that we need to apply to the footer component. I don't think we're going to have another collapsible somewhere else on this website with the exact same look. That's why I think this is probably the style of the collapsible inside a footer component. So later when we build the footer, we'll come back and revisit these styles.